Um, Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Joe Swimmer. I'm the Executive Director at Episcopal Parish Network, and very pleased today to be joined by our partner, Joanne Hanson from Church Investment Group, along with our friends from the Church Commissioners in the Church of England, Sofia, who is joining us today 6 hours ahead because British summertime has ended and is spending her evening with us. So thank you so much for that, Sofia. We're really looking forward to the conversation that they will have about the sustainability initiatives in the Church of England. And we are pleased to present this type of programming to help our parishes in the Episcopal Parish Network and the church generally. Look for additional content like this coming in the months ahead and at our annual conference, which will take place in Kansas City, February 25th through 28th. We hope you'll join us there. We'll have Presiding Bishop Sean Rowe for one of his first church-wide events. It should be an exciting time. And of course, Joanne will be with us as well. We are thrilled to have them with us. Thank you so much. Without anything else from me, I'm going to hand it off to Joanne and Sofia. And thank you so much for joining us today, ladies.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Joanne Hanson. I'm the president of the Church Investment Group. CIG is a nonprofit that works with Episcopal endowments on their journey to align their faith-based values with their financial goals. And our objective is to foster both profitable, sustainable investing and environmental care. So I am thrilled today to talk with and learn from Sofia Bartholdy, the Responsible Investment Integration Director at the Church Commissioners for England. Sofia is the strategic lead for the Commissioner's approach to climate change and responsible investment integration, and that's including assessing the impact of investments and, importantly, investing for solutions. So her responsibilities include implementing a strategy to meet the Commissioner's net zero target by 2050 and working with the internal investment team to review external investment managers regarding their responsible investment practices and the sustainability outcomes of their investments. In addition, she's on the board of directors of the Transition Pathway Initiative, which is a very important organization that assesses corporations' preparedness to transition to a low-carbon economy. I want to highlight her academic background, which is an interesting one. She has a master's in science in applied economics and finance from Copenhagen's Business School and a master's in science in ecological economics from Edinburgh University. So we'd like to make this an interactive discussion, so please feel free to type your questions in the chat and we'll look to address them as we go along. The Episcopal Church is part of the Anglican Communion, but I confess I myself have learned a great deal over time, and you may not be familiar with who are the church commissioners and what do they do. So as an opening, set the template in the background. Sofia, can you tell us about the organization and its missions?
Yes, and good evening or good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having me today. So I will, sorry, I'm sharing slides and speaking at the same time. So just to set the scene, so the Church Commissioners for England is, or the Church Commissioners, or even the Commissioners, is one of the Church of England's national church institutions. We were formed from a merger of two predecessor organizations in 1948. So it's the Queen Anne's Bounty and the Ecclesiastical Commissioners, one of which dates back to 320 years. Our purpose as an organization is to support the Church of England's ministry, particularly in areas of need and opportunity. And in addition to the organization, the commissioners themselves are a group of 27 trustees, which include bishops, clergy, church estates commissioners, including a member of the British Parliament, as well as trustees with relevant skills within, for example, investments. The role of the Church Commissioners for England is, so we have multiple different roles, but A key one is the responsible investment of the Church of England's endowment fund. But aside from that, we also want to maximize sustainable distributions to support the mission and ministry of the Church of England, run and provide other administrative support and regulatory processes. So that includes supporting the bishops and archbishops. It includes supporting cathedrals, as well as parish reorganizations and the future use of closed churches, and the Lambeth Palace Library and Archive. We also house the steering and providing of funding for the Church of England's net zero ambition, which is slightly separate to the Church Commissioner's investment fund's net zero target. So all of these work streams are enabled by a talented team and good governance, and is really underpinned by the National Church Institution's values, which is to strive for excellence, act with integrity, respect others, show compassion, and collaborate. So in terms of the Church of England's net zero target, we have as an institution, we have a net zero by 2030 target. Now, this target really covers the buildings within the Church of England and the national church institutions. So that includes churches, church buildings, schools, and housing. And the target really covers the emissions related to primary energy use, as well as electricity use and business travel. We also have other sources of emissions within the church, and while some of them are within scope, the time frame is a bit longer. And as mentioned, the investment fund, the endowment fund within the church commissioners has its separate plan. So in this net zero target, we've looked at what are the sources of emissions within what's within scope. And as you can see, almost half of it is from schools. But in addition to that, we also have churches and housing as two key sources. So it is really the buildings. Now that has led to us to house this net zero carbon program board, which we've onboarded over the last year or two. And they really drive the efforts of the whole church, and is a team that sits within the church commissioners, and their responsibilities include things like supporting the cathedrals, churches, church schools, clergy housing, theological colleges, offices, and others in their efforts to reduce emissions. And a lot of the actions that really sit there are around demonstrating leadership in responding to the climate emergency, in which this is a critical decade. It's sharing learnings, leveraging additional funding, and enabling partnerships. So they've just released their first impact report this summer, which you'll be able to find on our website. And it's very impressive what they've managed to do with such a new program.
So one of the reasons that I'm so excited to have Sofia speak today, I mean, she's talking to the physical side of the church, which everybody who has buildings has to deal with, but also she's going to go on to talk about the investment side. And the church commissioners really have had a long-standing ambition to be at the forefront of responsible investing around the world. And they're looking at three systemic risks that we all need to think about in our portfolios: climate change, nature loss, and then social inequality. And so I've seen the commissioners walk the walk, and you're going to get an opportunity to see that as Sofia continues to share, to see the evolution of the efforts of the church, which have culminated in their net zero, both physically and for their portfolios. So Sofia, we're going to transition to the investment side of the fence. And can you just share about the overall approach, and then to a little more under the hood of what are the most important characteristics you're looking for your external managers?
Yes, happy to. And for those of you who don't know our fund, we just for background, we're £10.4 billion investment fund with a return target of inflation plus 4%. But as mentioned, our key purpose is to be able to provide sustainable distributions to the church. And we do that within our responsible investment principles of respecting people and respecting the planet. In terms of our responsible investment approach, it's really underpinned by our responsible investment and responsible and ethical investment policy. And we receive advice from the Church of England's Ethical Investment Advisory Group. And then we have some high-level commitments, which is really to the principles for responsible investing. It's the UK Stewardship Code about being a responsible steward of your assets, and to be Paris aligned. So that's our net zero ambition. As you mentioned, we have a key 3 themes that we see as systemic risks within the area or within the world. So that's climate change, nature loss, and social inequality, as we see as these big systemic risks to society. And while they are 3 distinct themes, we also see significant overlap. Now, all of this can seem quite overwhelming. So when we're thinking about what our role is as an institutional investor and as a faith-based investor, we've listed some of the key activities. And it's really about we restrict the companies that we do not want to be exposed to. So we do have exclusions in place because of ethical reasons. So that includes things like tobacco or gambling. But then we also have an engagement program which focuses on engaging with companies. It could be engaging with regulators or policymakers in terms of some of the barriers to progress our work. And it could be engaging with the tenants on our land or in the buildings that we own. We also have, and we'll come on to this a bit more, but our responsible investment integration program, which is really about how we assess asset managers and monitor them while we're invested in terms of their approach. We provide transparent reporting, so you'll find a lot of materials on our website if you find our website. And we vote on our shares, as well as have a focus on how we can influence real world outcomes, both in terms of the investments that we select, but also how we can influence our entire investment portfolio to move towards that. So the overarching principle or the goal or the objective is really to support positive outcomes and reduce negative outcomes while managing risk both to and by the investment portfolio. I think in terms of if we talk a bit about the approach to assessing and monitoring managers, has been one of our key areas. So we are largely managed through external fund managers, particularly in the part of the investment portfolio that isn't real assets. And a key aspect of our plan is really on what questions we ask from the managers upfront before we invest with them, how we do our due diligence, but also how we then use that information to engage with the managers over time. We have our framework and our questionnaires. So we have a questionnaire that we've built, which is really based on sources such as the Principles for Responsible Investment. They have some questions that investors report to them on. So we've sourced some of the ones that we found most relevant. Our questionnaire focuses on things like, what policies do you have in place? What kind of governance do you have in place? Where's the oversight of your processes? Do you have a team? And how is that supported? But we also look at things like, for the specific investment strategy, how do you incorporate environmental, social, and governance factors? So it's not only about saying whether things are good or whether they're bad, but they're also just about understanding the risks and opportunities that could come from being in a coastal area where you see increased amounts of flooding, or where you see different a type of business that's really impacted by increased droughts, or it could be around their labor conditions. And we look at how the managers are assessing that information, how it features into their own decision making, as well as how they engage with companies. And that's really strategy specific and where we need to understand their approach. Then because of our objectives around our net zero target, we focus on nature loss and we focus on social inequality. We also look at what their approaches are to that. And lastly, we do consider how our managers are implementing in their own teams an approach to diversity and inclusion and how they are themselves are inclusive employers. So that's really how we assess managers and the areas that we focus on.
So at this stage of your portfolio, would you say that everyone has embraced responsible investing, or is it are there managers, pre-existing managers, or even new managers where you look to engage with them and sort of bring them along in the process?
So I would say that um, maybe to start with, we have a very diversified portfolio. So we are, because we're of quite a large size, we have a quite a high return target. We're very diversified. So we look at things like listed equity, but we also focus on private markets. So it could be private equity or venture capital. And what we see is that there's very different maturity within the different asset classes. There's a different case for incorporating these factors if you're a long-term holder of a company compared to having a shorter time horizon. We as a fund have a long-term time horizon. And we want our managers to be aligned with that, but we know that part of the selection is that they will also have different time horizons. So as a general rule, we have a minimum criteria that we want them to meet. So that includes criteria around reporting and our exclusions. And then we engage with the managers over time to hopefully for them to improve their processes. So we have a lot of managers who are doing amazing work and are really leaders in their space and in their field. And we have managers who are incredible in some areas, but could improve in others. And then we have managers that are a bit early in the journey who we continue to engage with.
So net zero is a very complex concept, and it's an even more complex reality. So can you talk about how you're approaching the world emissions system, and then taking that information, how do you translate it through into portfolio decisions?
Yes, I can. So I think so. We have a net zero target, and you may or may not have heard these net zero targets being published by companies, governments, local governments, or investors. But where we really see it is that it's commitment for us to transition our investment portfolio. But the focus is really on the real world emissions. So we can make changes in the sectors that we allocate to or the types of companies, and we can make our portfolio look very good very easily, um, theoretically. Um, uh, I should say
Divest, and then that
things,
simplifies things.
yeah, yeah. Say investment team might not agree with the ease of it, but it's conceptually very easy to do. But when we look at the objective is really to decarbonize. And the reason for that is that we want to do our bit to help us meet the Paris Agreement and to avoid harm to people and to the planet. So our focus is on the real economy and how we can use our levers to affect that. And when we look at so partly we set our net zero ambition in 2020, but it really builds on a very long period of time where we focused on climate change. So we were one of the first investors to co-file shareholder resolutions with oil and gas companies. We've helped co-found organizations like the Transition Pathway Initiative. So it was really a long time where we've been working in the area of climate change, and then in 2020 we set our target. So when we look at how or where emissions come from in the world, if that's our baseline, if we look at decarbonizing the world, it really comes from energy. And that's fossil fuels being used for various different industries, including buildings, transport, production in industry, as well as kind of waste, so fugitive emissions. But we also see significant emissions from, for example, livestock, deforestation and waste, and then some specific industrial processes. And when we look at how to, if you had to have a easy to-do list of how to decarbonize the world, broadly, you look at 3 themes or 6 themes. So you're looking at electrifying transport, decarbonizing the electricity grid, fixing the food system. So looking at land use, for example, is cleaning up industry, protecting nature, and removing carbon. And it's important to mention that no single stakeholder can do this in isolation. So governments can't fix the problem alone. Companies can't fix it alone, and investors can't fix it alone. But we all affect, and we can all influence whether we're moving in the right direction. And that includes civil society, it includes individuals and consumers, but they don't hold the responsibility alone or the ability alone. But another thing to remember is that we also all influence each other. So not only as an investor can we influence the net or energy transition, but we can also influence companies. And I put here that everyone influences everyone, and that's true to some extent. Some influence others more than others. But it's also to empower that individuals do have a say in it and can influence other institutions as well.
So I think that's one of the things that's impressive about the commissioners is they really, across multiple fronts, are looking to influence both the real world, but they're also looking to future-proof their own portfolio. So can you talk about and you're showing them here, the levers that you apply both externally in the external world, but then against for the benefit of your portfolio?
Yes. Yeah, so when we looked at how we can meet our climate objectives, we really thought hard about what can we do, what's within our remit, where are our strengths as an organizations, and what's our role as an investor. And that have divided it into 3 themes, which are really inspired by the impact management projects, kind of levers for impact as an investor. But so when you look at these 3 actions, they're quite different. And I think aligning our processes is really where we say as an organization, we should have good governance. We should measure our emissions and the outcomes of our portfolio. We should, there are certain areas of the market that we don't want to be exposed to, and I'll talk a bit about it later, but we restricted oil and gas exploration, production, and refining last year from our portfolio, and we've set interim emissions reduction targets. Now we know that none of these actions in themselves will change emissions, but we partly think they're good governance and that they are good practice from our side. But it's also areas that if the broader market takes these types of actions up, that's where it can have broader impact. So around, for example, if you have similar better governance around climate or better management and monitoring of the portfolio outcomes, we think this can have an impact if a wider group of investors or the wider industry takes this up. But where we ourselves can influence the outcomes more directly is really around engagement, both directly and indirectly, because we can engage with our managers. So as mentioned, we have our framework and how we assess and monitor them. But we also engage directly with particularly listed companies. So companies listed on stock exchanges, so the large ones, partly through collaborative efforts, such as Climate Action 100, which focuses on the largest emitters in the world, and focusing on how they can transition and set targets. We also are members of other groups. So it could be the finance sector deforestation action group that focuses on companies with links to deforestation in soft commodity to supply chains. But we also engage with some companies bilaterally, so directly with them. And we engage with policymakers, so that could be on the broad commitments that governments have made to net zero and sticking to them and enabling an environment where we can deliver on it as investors and as companies. And it can be with our tenants. So we have a significant farmland portfolio and a property portfolio, so engaging with our tenants on how we can collaborate in meeting our objectives. And then the third lever, as an investor, we can invest and enable solutions to climate change and nature loss. So we have significant exposures, and I'll talk a bit more about this later as well. But this is really where we can partly understand our exposure to solutions, but also invest directly into them or enable transitions within our assets. So those are really the high level kind of levers. Now, if
So,
we,
Sophia, could
oh,
I
go,
just
yeah,
pose a question
of course,
that
yeah,
came in, which I think relates more on the engagement side.
yes,
So COP29 is coming up. We were
yeah.
asked the question by someone who is a delegate. What would you like to, and it's a bit challenging, the upcoming location of the next COP. What would the commissioners like to see coming out of that? I don't know, do the commissioners and the Episcopal Church hold hands in any respect as they go into that engagement? Because they were also asking sort of what the Episcopal Church should focus on in terms of key issues.
Um,
I just asked this gigantic question. We could go the rest of the webinar on this one, but
I think we could. I think it's a really good question. I think one of my colleagues would be a much better responder to this question because she is going. But I, I mean, on a broad level, it is just progress and continuing to move forward. So I know it's not the most tangible answer, but I think that's really on the high level. Um, and I would like to defer to my colleague. It's an area that we are looking in at as a team. I've had a focus on other areas while she's been preparing. So I won't go more into detail on that. But yeah.
and just do you do the commissioners sort of share blog posts or various other things as they get ready to go, kind of what their objectives are, if people here are looking to go get a deeper sense?
So I would say so. I sit within our investment team. As an investment team, we would not put any kind of expectations out. And unfortunately, I can't answer the question on behalf of the broader Church of England. Um, but I am happy to look into it.
And so we will move on to the data gathering aspect of this, which we will hopefully towards the end talk about how does some of this translate through if you are not the billions that either the church commissioners or the church pension group are. And data collecting is one of the big challenges because it's energy and staff intensive. You can turn to your investment manager and say, okay, are you doing this analytical work? But I think in the case of the commissioners, it's both internal and external.
Yeah, yeah. So we utilize our managers where we can. I think so it works slightly differently in different asset classes. So currently we collect and report emissions in our public equity portfolio as well as our real assets portfolio. Now our emissions are a mix of reported emissions and estimates, and the estimates really happen on different levels. So partly we have estimates of some of our direct real assets portfolio, as you can see here, but where we get reported emissions from our infrastructure managers, for example, some of that is estimated, some of that is directly measured. In public equities, what we do, so we have multiple different managers, and I think that's probably the asset class that's most relevant for others, is you can get manager, or many managers will be able to get the data. But one of the things to be mindful of is the detail. It's around dates. It's around are the sources the same? The data sources differ slightly, particularly on their estimates. And especially dates lining up can make a significant difference, or even exchange rates, if it's companies listed in other countries and how that's been translated. So I would say if collecting from managers, those are some of the things to be mindful of. But many managers should be able to, particularly in public markets, because when companies are listed, they will have so many owners. There are data companies that collect data where companies report and fill in the gaps with estimates, so they can provide good portfolio coverage of most equity portfolios, if you have the information of the companies that you hold. And if you don't have that granular level, then the managers can collect this data. So you have multiple data providers being able to fill the gap, but it does come at a cost. I would say in our public equity portfolio, our managers have access to the data. So it is something that should be doable for the vast majority in public markets, but there are just the devil's in the detail when you ask the managers report on it. Now for other asset classes, we are continuously working on collecting the data, but it's much more heavy on collecting from managers, which just takes longer, especially if you have many of them. So we work to increase. So we've this year we increased our infrastructure coverage from just over 60% to 90% of the portfolio being covered by emissions data. So we've seen a big increase there, and we're hoping to see similar increases across other private markets in particular. I'm happy to move on to
I think just touching on
the
the engagement side of things.
Yeah.
In the Episcopal Church, there is the CCSR. I'm going to see if I can get it right. The Committee for Corporate Social Responsibility, which works with Mercy Investment in engagement, as does the Church Pension Group, works actively with them as well.
Sounds I'm happy, unless there are any questions to the data. I can move to.
Yeah, I think just shift to policy engagement.
Yeah, I can. So these are just some of the examples that I mentioned before, but around policy engagement, and as you could probably hear in my answer to the COP question, is really my colleague leading on this work, and where we are as an organization is that we've particularly been involved in industry initiatives. So that's where we collaborate with other investors and with investor initiatives. So we're a member of the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance and the UK Sustainable Investing Forum, which both have policy tracks. So focusing on the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, focusing on policy barriers for us to meet our targets. And UK SIF has a broader mandate around policy. But my colleague has been co-leading the policy tracks there, really engaging partly with the UK government, but also more globally. And then we have done work around in the investor policy dialogue on deforestation, which has focused on countries which are particularly at risk of deforestation in high biodiversity areas. So Again, my colleague has been co-leading the track for Indonesia and engaging with the Indonesian government on putting in place controls, particularly around illegal deforestation. And the initiative also has a working group focusing on Brazil, and are now also looking at the consumer countries, so the importing countries, and how to engage with those governments to put in place controls to ensure that products and services coming in are deforestation free. So those are some of the areas where we've worked with other investors. We also do some direct policy engagement on various areas across the portfolio, and around really enabling for us to meet sustainability objectives and kind of to progress our work. So it's really around kind of breaking down some of these system barriers for us to move forward. In terms of some of the, so there's partly the policy engagement, but also just collaborating with the industry more broadly. So a lot of these you will see are quite real estate specific and UK specific, because that's a big part of our portfolio and where we see a lot of value, but we also supporting initiatives such as the ESG Data Convergence Initiative, which focuses on getting private markets managers to report on, for example, emissions data, among other things, in a consistent way. And the investors or asset owners asking for the data commit to asking for it in the same way, thereby reducing the amount of different asks, which should enable the private equity managers to better provide us with the data. We think that's an incredibly good initiative. We also are members of the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, which is really where we've put our net zero commitment through. We're co-founders and sit on the board, or I sit on the board of the Transition Pathway Initiative. And as you mentioned, it focuses on companies, and increasingly has also implemented or onboarded an initiative called ASCOR, which focuses on kind of sovereign transition plans. So that's really countries' transition plans and where they're moving. It's all open source. These are free resources for everyone to use. It's hosted by the London School of Economics at the Grantham Institute. So we see these as kind of collaborating with the industry to move everyone forward and to help everyone be able to partly get more information on their portfolios, but then also to act on that information. So that was just it's a slightly colorful and overwhelming list.
Well, so we can move to the exciting part, which is investing in solutions. And
Yes.
again, that can be a challenge for smaller endowments. The church pension group, for example, is active in affordable housing, in renewables, and a lot of this is on the private investment side, very significant and important and long-term investment work. I think for smaller endowments, there are opportunities in fixed income, and there are thematic investments that a organization can take a look at. But this is some of the exciting work that the Church Commissioners has done, and I'll let Sophia talk about one or two. I mean, Bridges, I think, is in the affordable housing space.
Yeah, and actually the fund that we are invested in is focused on green buildings, but part of that is also affordable. So we kind of double up. So yeah, so that's actually one of the examples where we've invested in a fund that it's partly building and partly refurbishing, but really making buildings green and certified green, so you can track that. We also have Pioneer Infrastructure Partners, which is an energy transition, so focusing on renewables and related investments. Our largest category is around our sustainable forestry or timberland portfolio, which is commercial timberland, but it's all certified to the relevant sustainability standards in the country. So FSC certified in the UK, and it means that 20% of the land is managed for sustainable biodiversity. So, and we really see timberland, there's partly the carbon sequestering abilities, but also when you have commercial timber and harvest it, using that as a more sustainable building material. So when you use it in buildings, it replaces other higher emitting materials. So it has multiple co-benefits. So those are some of the examples. But I think to your point, it's a focus, especially when we look at the more pure play funds or the dedicated funds to solutions. It has been in private markets and in real assets, but we do see interesting things in our public markets portfolio as well. We're not as exposed to fixed income, but it is an area. So we issued a sustainability bond. So we may be in other people's investment portfolios, or other investors' portfolios. But in our public equity portfolio, we have managers who, while we wouldn't categorize them as kind of a solution, their entire investment thesis is opportunities related to the energy transition. So it focuses on broad aspects. So it could be electric utilities, and the electrification. So we see it in many different aspects, and there's some which are kind of very clean impact investments, and then you move all the way to up to more kind of opportunity sets. And we also, so when we measure our exposure to solutions, we also look at the underlying companies, and there are companies across the whole industry or the whole world economy that do provide solutions. So you will find solutions in the healthcare space. You will find them in industrials producing things like wind turbines. So we do also see that in more generalist funds that we do have exposure to that.
So we've been talking a great deal about climate, but I think another very important thread that the Church Commissioners has been involved in is human rights, quality worker treatment, concern for folks in the mining industry. So do you want to talk just a bit on your efforts, the Commission's efforts in that respect?
Yes, I'm very happy to. So our approach so when we look at our approach to human rights, is really that respect for human rights underpins our approach to the social themes within our respect for people work. So we have a human rights and our responsible investment policy. We recognize all businesses have a responsibility to respect human rights, and we ourselves commit to implementing global good practices to identify and acting on human rights risks and impacts across our investments. But this looks different across the different types of assets, and depends on things like how much influence we have and visibility across the portfolio, which is different across different asset classes. Now we have an approach which kind of builds on our foundation or policy commitments. So we this slide shows, hopefully people can see it, it's a bit small, but when we look at human rights in our stewardship approach, kind of the basic or the kind of at the asset level. So on the foundation, it's around engaging on specific issues. So that could be in our like related to human rights due diligence processes. So it could be issues around modern slavery, child labor, where and it is either where we see really high risks or where we've seen unfortunately cases of actual incidents. We've also kind of on a more systematic basis, we've introduced a voting approach where we vote, we kind of take active stances of voting against companies that aren't meeting our expectations, so our human rights laggards. So that includes, so we assess things like policy commitments and due diligence approaches. And on the manager level, that's one of the areas that we've introduced to assess our managers. So our external fund managers, and their approach and how they're approaching this. We can see that it's a newer area and there's still a lot of progress to be made there. And then at kind of the high level and related to our work on kind of collaborating with the industry, we've co-founded a investor coalition to improve the quality and quantity of human rights data that you get from companies. So we engage with the large data providers that also provide data around emissions or sustainability scores. So it's really kind of focusing our actions and where we have influence and what we can do at different levels. So yeah, so that's kind of how we've approached human rights, and we have a report setting out the voting. I think I've promised to send PDF versions of these. Yeah, so we have a bit more information on our website on how we approach it.
So as we might translate to a smaller endowment, I think if churches are interested in being on a faith-based pathway, as the church commissioners are, you're asking yourself the question of what do we want to pursue? What are our important values? And then just asking questions of your managers, what is their perspective on this? Are they engaging in it? But Sofia, do you have any suggestions for folks who would like to take the things that you do on a day-to-day basis and kind of translate it down into a smaller endowment?
Yeah, I think it is important to recognize that different investors, whether that's size or whether that's other factors, will mean different levels of influence. It could also be in investment strategy, whether there's a focus on more pooled funds or whether they're more kind of segregated accounts where we can get a bit more of our approach through. But so one of the areas that we have that some managers will offer is around are there areas that investors don't want to be exposed to because of faith-based or ethical reasons. That is kind of not every product or every manager will offer it for smaller investors, but there are areas where that can be done. But the other thing and the key thing I think is really speaking to the managers and doing the due diligence and understanding their process and seeing how they align. And I think the key areas and what it often comes back to is around the governance and around also just intellectual curiosity around some of these sustainability themes, which might play out in the longer term, or it's looking a bit more at the context in which an investment thesis operates. And some asset managers or fund managers really get it, and some there are more conversations, and it's really doing that digging. And I think the foundations are really around the governance. Do they have policies in place? Can they collect the data? Will they speak to you about it? So I think the manager side is really key in selecting managers, and there are managers who can do this and who can work with you. So yeah,
Who have the passion for it and the
yeah,
commitment to it.
and it's not the first time they hear it.
Yeah, well, and I think if they're, sustainability person is a young, young staffer in the side hallway, that's a question.
Yeah,
I think
definitely.
um, I had the blessing to participate with Adam Matthews, who's with the Church Commissioners, in a conference in Edinburgh a number of years ago. And the church was laying out, the commissioners were laying out that we intend to engage with fossil fuel companies. But if we don't see this as productive, we're ultimately going to say, this is not productive and this doesn't make sense for us to continue to invest. And I think in 2023, that was a decision that the commissioners came to. Can you speak briefly to that process? It was laid out a bit in the long sweep of the climate engagement that the commissioners has done.
Yes. So in 2018, so within the Church of England, we have three national investing bodies, of which the Church Commissioners were one of them. So we manage the endowment fund. And there's the Church of England Pensions Board, which manages the pension fund for the church employees. And that's where Adam sits. And then there's a third fund, the CBF funds managed by an asset manager called CCLA. And so the national investing bodies, and I'll speak on behalf of the church commissioners, but we made a commitment to the General Synod, which is the Church of England's kind of, if you will, a parliament, to engage with high emitting companies and divest or exclude fossil fuel companies that did not align with the objectives of the Paris Agreement by 2023. So we had a 5-year time horizon, and we put in place thresholds every year to say companies within this area, so it could be, so our focus companies were the Climate Action 100 companies, which are it's not 100 plus, so it's 160 odd companies that are the highest emitting companies, and they're responsible for approximately 2/3 of industrial emissions in the world. So it's very concentrated there. And we set out these thresholds every year towards 2023, and if companies failed those, we would exclude them, and we would send letters to them and engage on kind of putting in place transition plans. When 2023 came, we assessed the fossil fuel companies. So we focused on the oil majors and found that none of them were credibly aligned with the Paris Agreement in the short, medium, and long term. We based that analysis on the transition pathway initiative that we co-launched with Church of England Pensions Board, among others. But we did not feel confident in the transition plans. Some of them had some commitments, but they weren't. None of them were moving at speed or scale that was necessary to meet the objectives of the Paris Agreement. So we made the decision to exclude those companies, and at the same time committed to exclude companies whose primary business comes from oil and gas exploration, production, and refining, unless they're credibly aligned with a 1.5-degree world, which is the more ambitious Paris Agreement objectives. So we finalized that program at the end of 2023 because we didn't see that as aligned with our long-term objectives and the long-term value of the fund, because we did not see them as moving fast enough. So that was a quite substantial process. I would say, while we are a big investor in the faith-based community, we are still a relatively small investor in the context of the global financial markets. So it's our voice definitely carries more than the numbers, but yeah, we made that decision because we didn't want to be exposed anymore.
Well, the hour has flown by, and I deeply appreciate you're making the time to, particularly later in the evening, to share with us the role that the Church Commissioners is taking, and very seriously, in terms of how it integrates faith premises into its investment portfolio. And I will say that the Church Commissioners is one of the more profitable investors out there. So it's important to emphasize to folks that this is something that alignment can be a profitable investment approach. So Sofia, thank you very much. I'm not sure if Joe is going to pop back in here at the tail end. But it's
going to say thank you, Joanne, Sophia. Thank you for staying up late and joining us. And thanks to everyone. We will have this recording available in our library. Please share it in your networks. And it was a wonderful presentation. Thanks so much to you both.
Well, we
Thank you.
deeply appreciate you educating us in all of the areas that you are in, and particularly asking managers those questions of how are you approaching these very critical systemic issues and risks in portfolios. So thank you very much, Sophia.
Thank you so much for having me.